Well, as the weather warms up and pandemic restrictions ease, police departments across the country are bracing for an uptick in violent crime. Across the nation, murders increased by 24% at the beginning of this year compared to last year, and that includes larger cities like Los Angeles and New York, but also smaller cities like Omaha and Louisville. Bill Bratton, who served as police commissioner for the NYPD, LAPD, and the Boston Police Department, well, actually the chief of the LAPD, tackles the issue in his new book, The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America. And Bill Bratton joins us now with more. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you are here. We should mention that you are also married to CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman, who we absolutely adore. Just so you know.
Welcome
you can pass that on to her. I bet. So let's start. Let's look into this. We have been seeing, I can imagine, we've been seeing an uptick in violent crime and in particular homicides across the country, especially a lot of these big cities. And, you know, two of those big cities you know very, very well. You also worked in Boston as a police officer. What factors do you believe, have been leading to sort of this rise in crime that we've been seeing across the nation? And do you think that there is perhaps a series or themes that could be addressed in all of the cities that would help to bring the crime rate down?
The fact is very much in dispute at the moment. Everybody seems to have an opinion. I'll share mine with you. Something to understand, while you talked about the homicides, the more significant problem is the number of shootings. That with trauma centers and the expertise that developed over the years, we would have many more homicide victims, but for the fact that they are able to save so many lives in those trauma centers. So the shooting numbers is something we started tracking in New York in the 90s. Nobody was tracking shootings, they were just tracking murders. And the problem is that in the 75 largest cities in this country, the number of murders and shootings are both up in most of those cities. Ironically, a lot of other crime is down in some cities, no two cities being alike. But the factors I believe are causing it are several. One, the ready availability of guns. We have 400 million guns in this country. They're everywhere. And they're easy to acquire. And we have a Congress of the United States that refuses to tighten controls on that issue. So politicians, in many respects, are creating the crime crises in America because of their inaction to, within the constitutional guidelines, tighten controls. Secondly, we have police who, in many cities around the country, have pulled back since the George Floyd incident. But even before that, around the country, politicians were changing the rules of the game, taking away many of the tools that police use to enforce the law. And so police in many cities, New York City, where I'm sitting at the moment, have pulled back from enforcing so many of the things that people see every day, the quality of life. And we have court systems and district attorneys around the country that are effectively refusing to think of the victim first, but are now thinking of criminals and criminal rights. What can we do to strengthen the rights of criminals rather than strengthening the rights of victims? So we have a sea change that has occurred very rapidly that we are going to see the impact for years to come. Good news is that out of every crisis comes opportunity. We can have criminal justice reform. I write a lot about that in the book, The Profession. We know how to do this. It's just a matter of basically not repeating the mistakes of the past, learning from that, and going forward.
Yeah, Chief, in addition to your book, I thought it was interesting. You wrote a New York Times op-ed, and you also spoke to Maureen Dowd about your book, The Profession. And you write this: be careful what you wish for, because sometimes it's going to come and bite you in the butt. I used a different word, but that's effectively the defund the police movement. They got what they wanted. They defunded the police. What do they get? Rising crime, cops leaving in droves, difficulty recruiting. Now they're waking up to the fact that our cities are unsafe. But Emery and I have talked about this several times about the notion of defunding the police. In your mind, what is it that people are looking for? I mean, you say that they've taken away the tools that make crime fighting effective, but others would say they're actually looking to enhance what police are able to do when it comes to fighting crime by taking away some of the things that may make the life of a patrolman overwhelming. In other words, having to deal with a lot of things that you didn't have to deal with when you were a beat cop. What do you say to that?
Well, actually, as a beat cop back in the 70s, and that's just that arc that I talk about in the book, we're right back where we started 70 years ago, and I'll explain that in just a second. But the editorial, the op-ed you're referring to is the Washington Post. And effectively, I talk about in the book, and I'll be talking increasingly about the issue of defund the police. It's political hyperbole driving public policy. Its impact has largely been symbolic rather than in actuality. That overall, there was a study I just saw that actual cuts to police budgets, police spend about $100 billion a year on policing in this country, or government spends about $100 billion. There's been about $1 billion to $2 billion that has actually been cut. And so those cuts, a lot of them that were talked about, the hyperbole, didn't in fact occur. And many cities that did implement cuts, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, even New York, have in fact restored many of those cuts. But the damage has been done in the sense that it was believed that we could take money away from the police and put it into other areas where police have not been doing a good job. And that's dealing with the emotionally disturbed, dealing with the homeless, dealing with the individuals who are basically coming out of prison, that we have effectively recreated in the 21st century the mistakes of the 1970s in the 20th. We deinstitutionalized the mental institutions in the 70s. We were going to basically have alternatives. We didn't pay for it, and what did we end up with? On the streets, the homeless, the emotionally disturbed. We decriminalized in the 70s. We took away a lot of the tools the police had to work with by basically taking away a lot of the laws we used to enforce. And we depoliced in the 70s. City of Boston, I laid off 25% of the cops in Boston. New York laid off 5,000. What's going on in New York right now? The NYPD has lost over 2,000 officers in the last year. They don't have overtime to work with. And they're still talking, one of the candidates in the mayor's race, unbelievably, is talking about taking $2 billion more out of the budget and reducing the size of the force by another 2,500 officers. So defund has been largely symbolic, but it is still driving some of the thinking. And police would like to get out of the business of dealing with the emotionally disturbed, dealing with the drug addicts, but we can't. Why? Because government doesn't know how to effectively deal with those problems. Or it talks about it a lot, throws a lot of money at it. New York City, the mayor threw $1 billion at this, the problem, the emotionally disturbed, and what did he get? Zero. No change at all. So who ends up in the default on defunding? The police. So let's better fund the police, better train them, better equip them, because the reality is, who are you going to call? You're going to call 911, you're going to call 311, and who's going to come? The police.
So, you talk about better train them. What would that look like? Because I've heard you also talk about the fact that there are so many guns here in this country, that police training has become hyper-focused on dealing with people with guns. And not just the training, but also the mentality that police officers have when they go out on their job. They're sort of always aware of the fact that there's a possibility someone that they're interacting with may have a gun. I presume that training is necessary, but then how would you change the police training to help them interact better with those who are mentally ill or having sort of other issues that are not related specifically to crime?
In the book, I talk a lot about the issue of training. I was on the streets of Boston after 8 weeks of training with a gun, a badge, and the power to take your life. Ridiculous. Now, on average, we train 4 to 6 months. Still not nearly enough. A minimum of at least a year. Because in the 21st century, we're dealing with many more complex problems than just crime and disorder. We're dealing with the mentally ill. We're dealing with the drug addicted. We're dealing with the homeless population. We're dealing with all types of different crime, including terrorism. So that the complexity of policing has changed, but we really have not changed the length of time that we train our officers. Instead, we just compress more issues to try and master. You've raised the point about training officers to deal with gun violence. That's going to get worse in the United States. The Supreme Court in October will pretty much basically come down with a ruling that everybody can carry a gun just about everywhere, anywhere. And that's going to raise the issue of concern on police officers' part that everybody they encounter might have a gun. With 46 police officers killed already this year, you can understand why officers are concerned. At the same time, we're trying to encourage them to de-escalate. We're trying to encourage them to not have implicit bias. All that training is important and it's critical, but you can't compress it. You have to expand it. But that's the foolishness of defund the police. We need to refund and dramatically expand the length of training, quality of training, and what they're being trained to effectively do. It's going to cost money. And at the same time, they're talking about taking responsibilities away. Cops would love to get rid of dealing with the emotionally disturbed, the homeless, the addicted to opioids or whatever. It's not going to happen. Government, I can guarantee, is not going to create all these new bureaucracies. Some cities might. New York tried, spent $1 billion on it and accomplished nothing. It's still going to fall back on the police. Isn't it better, even as you try to take some things away from the police or share things with police, to spend it on training? And
Chief,
to spend it on better hiring practices.
So one of the things that is sort of frightening is that there's this sort of volatile mix of things happening right now, which you point out. And something that you said that was sort of interesting, borne out by anecdotal evidence. I have a lot of friends who are former New York police officers, and they say what you say, that, a lot of cops right now are maybe not hitting the accelerator as fast as they should because they don't want to get to a scene of a crime because of some of the things that you're talking about. But the question, of course, becomes, do we want cops who, even with what's happening politically, with politicians, unwilling to do the job that they signed up to do? You've got that. You've also got NIMBYism, right? People who, will go out in the streets and protest and, maybe, talk about defunding the police, but say, not in my backyard, when they see a homeless person coming through. We've got a lot of outdoor dining, as you know, Chief, in the city now. And, I've seen it. I've seen the increase of the number of homeless people on the street. And you get people that say, well, I don't want to see that. So I need to call the police. But the police are saying, well, I can't come out because we're understaffed, we're undermanned. And then you've got the politicians that you're talking about. So, in fact, Anne-Marie and I have talked about this as well, where you've got people in underserved communities who still call 911 and still call 311 when something's happening in the hood. They want the cops to come out there and prevent crime from happening. So what is the solution, as you see it, as someone who's had great success in reforming police departments across this country? I know I'm asking you to fix the world's problems, Chief, but I mean, I want to get your thoughts on what we should do.
The old play, Glengarry Glen Ross, always be selling. Well, policing need ABI, always be reforming. There are no absolute solutions to some of the issues you've raised, but there's improvements that can be made. There's no denying in America right now, throughout the country, cops have pulled back, and you can't blame them. In city after city, district attorneys will not prosecute for minor offenses that people in the poorer neighborhoods and the richer neighborhoods are calling about, expect the police to respond and do something. But the police know if they respond and try to do something, they're not backed up by district attorneys around the country and politicians who effectively are staying hands off. New York City is the perfect example of that. Every Thursday night, there's a group of 50 or 60 anarchists that parade through the city and disrupt restaurants, disrupt stores, and police basically will do nothing against that group. Why? Because the store owners, restaurant owners won't prosecute, the customers won't prosecute in the sense of make complaints, and the district attorneys will absolutely do nothing against those individuals. So can you blame the police for effectively not putting themselves, their careers at risk, for not doing something when the politicians, when the judges, when the district attorneys, and even the victims are saying, we are fearful of these people, we don't want to engage with them? That can be changed, but we are in a bad place at the moment. Good news is, out of bad places, sometimes there's no place to go but to a better place. And being the eternal optimist, I came to this city in 1990 to straighten out the subways when nobody thought they could be fixed. We straightened them out so well that Giuliani campaigned on the idea he would do the same thing in the streets that have been done in the subways, and we did it. New York City, for 25 years, had reduced crime every year, reduced disorder, until 2018. What happened in 2018? Our wizards up in Albany basically passed criminal justice reform, bail reform, that undid most of the successes of the previous 30 years. And what's been the result? Rising crime, rising disorder. We've emptied out the prisons, which we're emptying out slowly. Prison population in New York went down dramatically. Murders went down 90%. Overall crime went down 80%. Cops were giving fewer summonses. Why? Fewer offenses. They were giving fewer citations. Why? There were fewer things to cite. We were in a good place. And then the legislature, the expression of bridge too far, upset the apple cart. They have legislation they're going to vote on this week, in the next couple of days, Vlad, that is disgraceful. They're going to try to pass a no-knock warrant issue in which officers with a no-knock warrant authorized by a judge because of its potential danger to the officers, they are going to require that the officers knock on the door, announce their presence, and wait 30 seconds with a no-knock warrant, by which time they have to get rid of the evidence, which is bad enough. But some of these criminals are being arrested for gun charges that allows them to arm themselves and get ready to take on the police coming through the door. The insanity of that. So can you blame the cops in some respects for saying, if you're not going to support us, why put our lives, why put our families' lives at risk? We want to do the job. But this is a shared responsibility. Right now, I would argue that the legislatures in many states, the political leadership, are abrogating their responsibilities.
Bill Bratton, we could talk to you for like an hour. There's so many other things I want to ask you about. Qualified immunity reform, right. The Justice and Policing Act, George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. There's so many things. So yeah, that's true. I can read the book, but hopefully we can have you back on again to discuss some of these other things that are happening in this country when it comes to law enforcement. Thank you so much, Bill Bratton.
Thank you. A lot to talk about. Thank you.
The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America, hits shelves tomorrow.